The air in the police precinct was thick with the usual chatter. Officers exchanging weekend stories, the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air, and the low hum of police scanners crackling in the background. It was a regular day for Officer Mark Reynolds, a seasoned cop who had spent over 15 years on the force. He was well liked by his colleagues, known for his sharp wit, no-nonsense attitude, and ability to crack jokes even in the most tense situations. Today was no different. A group of officers gathered around the holding cell where a young black man, Darius Carter, sat on the hard metal bench, his hands resting on his lap, eyes staring blankly at the floor. Darius had been picked up the night before for a minor offense, trespassing at a closed public park, though he insisted he had only taken a shortcut home. Officer Reynolds leaned against the counter, sipping from his coffee mug, watching Darius with a smirk. Then, with a casual air, he turned to his colleagues and said, "Looks like we got ourselves another future felon of the year. What do you think? Should we go ahead and reserve a cell for him in 10 years? The room erupted in laughter. Some officers chuckled half-heartedly, while others exchanged knowing glances. A few remained silent, uncomfortable with the joke but unwilling to challenge Reynolds. After all, he was well respected in the department. Darius shifted uncomfortably on the bench, but said nothing. He had heard comments like this before, on the streets, in school, even from authority figures who were supposed to serve and protect. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. The last thing he needed was to give them a reason to escalate the situation. But there was someone in the room who didn't laugh. Officer Jessica Morales. A relatively new recruit, she had already begun noticing patterns in the way certain individuals were treated differently. She had heard the jokes, seen the dismissive attitudes, and recognized the unspoken biases that shaped interactions between officers and civilians. Today, she felt a knot form in her stomach as Reynolds made his joke. Later that day, Morales found herself at her desk, replaying the moment in her mind. Something about Reynolds' joke, and the ease with which he had said it, bothered her. She pulled up his personnel file, scanning through the records. He had a clean record, at least on paper. No formal complaints, no disciplinary actions. But that didn't mean there wasn't more to the story. She wasn't the only one who felt uneasy. Another officer, a veteran who had been in the force even longer than Reynolds, shook his head as he walked past Morales' desk. "Reynolds has been around a long time. Too long. You'd be surprised what the old files might show if you knew where to look." That single comment sent a chill down Morales' spine. What was he implying? Outside the precinct, the world was changing. Conversations about racial injustice and police accountability were growing louder. Social media had become a powerful tool, exposing stories that once would have been buried. What Reynolds thought was just an offhand joke could easily become something much bigger. But for now, he had no reason to believe anything was amiss. He went about his day as usual, completely unaware that a storm was brewing, one that would bring his past back to haunt him in ways he never could have imagined. Officer Mark Reynolds didn't think much about the joke he had made earlier. To him, it was just another moment of camaraderie among his colleagues, something to lighten the mood in a job that often felt heavy. But what he failed to realize was that not everyone saw it that way. Jessica Morales couldn't shake the unease she felt. She had spent years studying criminology before joining the force, and she knew that casual jokes like Reynolds were often symptoms of something deeper. What did he really believe about the people he arrested? Did that mindset influence his actions on the job? Later that evening, she sat in the break room, scrolling through her phone when an old news story caught her eye. It was about a wrongful conviction case from nearly 2 decades ago. A young black man had been arrested for a robbery he swore he didn't commit. The case had fallen apart after new evidence emerged, but not before the man spent 5 years behind bars. The officer who had arrested him had been none other than Mark Reynolds. A chill ran down Morales' spine. Was this a coincidence, or was there more to the story? She dug deeper, pulling up archived reports. Reynolds had testified in the case, insisting that the suspect had looked suspicious and had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as she read through the transcripts, something struck her. Reynolds had used almost identical phrasing in several other cases involving black suspects. The patterns were impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, Darius Carter sat in his holding cell, reflecting on his life. He wasn't a saint. He had made mistakes before, but nothing that warranted the way people like Reynolds looked at him. He thought about the joke the officer had made, and though he had stayed quiet at the time, it gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the words, it was about the attitude behind them. This wasn't the first time someone had judged him before knowing his story. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed he was destined for failure. And deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. Darius' public defender arrived a few hours later, a young attorney named Malik Harris who had made it his mission to fight against racial bias in the justice system. After a brief conversation, Malik realized that Darius' arrest was flimsy at best. The officer who had picked him up hadn't even properly identified him before assuming he was trespassing. There were no signs of forced entry, no complaints from property owners. Malik promised to push for a dismissal, but he also knew this was part of a bigger problem. He had encountered Officer Reynolds before, and each time, it was the same story: minority suspects treated as criminals before the facts were even clear. At the same time, Morales decided to take her concerns to her supervisor, Sergeant Tom Davidson. She walked into his office, placed a printed report on his desk, and said, "I think there's something you need to see." Davidson skimmed the papers, his face hardening. "Reynolds has been on the force for a long time, Morales. You should be careful about making accusations." "I'm not accusing anyone," she countered. "But don't you think it's strange that the same patterns keep showing up in his cases?" Davidson sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Look, Reynolds has always been old school. But that doesn't mean he's corrupt." "Old school," Morales repeated, shaking her head. "Sergeant, we're not talking about a guy who just has a rough sense of humor. We're talking about someone whose record suggests a pattern of racial bias. I think it's worth looking into." Davidson rubbed his temples, clearly torn. He had known Reynolds for years. But Morales had a point. "I'll think about it," he finally said. "But for now, keep this between us." Morales left the office, unsure whether she had made progress or just placed a target on her back. Meanwhile, outside the department, the world was changing. Social media had made it easier for stories like these to come to light. And though Morales didn't know it yet, she wasn't the only one looking into Reynolds' past. A local journalist named Lisa Carter, Darius' older sister, had just received an anonymous tip about the officer, and she was about to uncover something that would shock the entire city. Lisa Carter sat at her desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she sifted through police records and old news articles. As a journalist, she had built her career on uncovering the truth, especially when it came to stories that others wanted buried. But this time, it was personal. Her younger brother, Darius, had been arrested under questionable circumstances, and she had a gut feeling that there was more to the officer behind it, Mark Reynolds. She had received an anonymous tip earlier that day. The message was simple: look into Reynolds' past. This isn't the first time. Lisa had covered enough police misconduct cases to know that where there was smoke, there was usually fire. So, she dug in, searching for anything that connected Reynolds to previous controversial cases. What she found sent a chill down her spine. There were multiple cases, young black men arrested on vague charges, their records stained before they had a chance to defend themselves. Many of them had been let go due to insufficient evidence, but others had been convicted based on Reynolds' testimony alone. A pattern was beginning to form, and it wasn't just coincidence. She cross-referenced court records, old news reports, and even social media complaints. There were whispers about Reynolds, allegations that never made it far enough to result in disciplinary action. It was always the same story: he's just doing his job, he's a good cop, don't question him. But Lisa wasn't going to let this slide. At the same time, Officer Jessica Morales was still wrestling with what she had discovered. She knew pushing too hard against a veteran cop like Reynolds could have consequences for her career, but ignoring it wasn't an option. She decided to reach out to someone she trusted, an internal affairs investigator named Daniel Brooks. When she met with him at a diner late that night, she wasted no time getting to the point. "I have reason to believe Reynolds has a history of targeting black men unfairly." Brooks raised an eyebrow but didn't look surprised. "You're not the first person to bring up concerns about him." Morales leaned forward. "So why hasn't anything been done?" Brooks sighed. "Because it's hard to prove intent. And Reynolds is careful. He doesn't leave enough of a trail to pin anything on him." Morales frowned. "What if I told you there's a journalist looking into him too?" Brooks looked interested. "Then we might have a chance." Meanwhile, Lisa Carter wasn't just sitting behind a computer. She was taking her investigation to the next level. She began contacting people who had previously been arrested by Reynolds. Some were hesitant to talk, fearing retaliation, but one man, Jamal Price, agreed to meet with her. Jamal had spent 4 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, based largely on Reynolds' testimony. His conviction was later overturned, but the damage had been done. "He ruined my life," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I guarantee you, I'm not the only one." Lisa recorded his story, her determination growing. She wasn't just uncovering a biased cop. She was exposing a system that had protected him for years. Back at the police department, Reynolds was completely unaware of the storm gathering around him. He still walked the halls with the same confidence, still cracked the same jokes, still believed he was untouchable. But the truth had a way of catching up with people, and Reynolds was about to find that out the hard way. Lisa Carter had everything she needed: the testimonies, the evidence, and the clear pattern of abuse by Officer Mark Reynolds. But breaking the story was one thing. Making sure it led to real consequences was another. She reached out to her editor at the local news station, pitching the story as an in-depth expose. "We're not just talking about one bad cop. We're talking about a system that lets people like him operate unchecked." Her editor hesitated. "You know this is going to get pushback, right?" Lisa nodded. "That's exactly why we need to do it." At the same time, Jessica Morales and Daniel Brooks from Internal Affairs were preparing their own move. Morales had compiled a file detailing every questionable arrest Reynolds had made over the years. Brooks had taken it further, tracking complaints against him that had mysteriously been dismissed. But the real breakthrough came when they uncovered a sealed file, an old internal investigation on Reynolds from over a decade ago. It had been quietly closed without disciplinary action, but the details were damning. Witness tampering, coercion, and an alarming pattern of racial profiling. "This should have ended his career," Brooks said, shaking his head. Instead, they buried it. Armed with this information, they took it straight to the chief of police, Robert Sinclair, a no-nonsense leader who had built his career on maintaining the department's reputation. Sinclair wasn't the type to take accusations lightly. When Morales and Brooks laid everything out, Sinclair sat in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. "Reynolds is a veteran officer. If we take him down, there's going to be backlash. And if we don't," Morales countered, "how many more lives will he ruin?" Sinclair sighed, rubbing his temples. "What's your plan?" Meanwhile, Lisa's story was about to break. The news station aired the segment during prime time, featuring interviews with former victims, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage. Calls for accountability flooded City Hall and the police department. The mayor was forced to respond. "We take these allegations seriously and will be launching an independent investigation." But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Officer Reynolds knew his days were numbered. He could feel the shift in the way his colleagues looked at him. The department was no longer protecting him. When Internal Affairs officially opened an inquiry, Reynolds was placed on administrative leave. But the real blow came when the district attorney announced they were reviewing past convictions tied to his testimony. Darius Carter, who had been at the center of this storm, was finally released. His case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. But for him, this wasn't just about freedom, it was about justice. As Reynolds walked out of the precinct for what would likely be the last time, Morales watched him go. She had done what was right, even when it wasn't easy. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The fallout from Lisa Carter's expose was bigger than anyone had expected. Protests erupted across the city, with activists demanding a full-scale review of the police department's disciplinary practices. The community wasn't satisfied with just one bad cop being removed. They wanted systemic change. The department scrambled to control the damage. Chief Robert Sinclair held a press conference, announcing a sweeping review of past cases handled by Reynolds. The district attorney's office followed up with their own statement, confirming that multiple wrongful convictions were being re-examined. For the first time in years, people who had been silenced were being heard. Lisa sat in her office, watching the news coverage. She had done what she set out to do, expose the truth. But she also knew this was just one battle in a much larger fight. The justice system was still flawed. There would always be more cases, more people like Reynolds, more hidden injustices. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jamal Price. "You did it. You made them listen. Thank you." She exhaled, feeling the weight of it all. This wasn't just her victory, it was theirs. Across town, Darius Carter was adjusting to life after his release. Though he was free, he had lost months of his life in jail. His future had been shaken, but not destroyed. Sitting with his sister, he asked, "Do you think this will change anything for real?" Lisa thought for a moment. It already has. But the fight isn't over. Officer Jessica Morales also felt the impact. After everything that had happened, she was at a crossroads. Did she still believe in the system she had sworn to uphold? Could she continue to wear the badge knowing how deep the problems ran? In the end, she made a choice, not to walk away, but to push for real reform from the inside. "We can't fix what we abandon," she told herself. As for Mark Reynolds, he faced his own reckoning. Internal Affairs completed their investigation, and the evidence was undeniable. He was formally dismissed from the force, and legal experts speculated that criminal charges could follow. The man who had spent years abusing his power was finally powerless. In the months that followed, the city implemented new oversight measures for police misconduct cases. Civilian review boards were strengthened, and the voices of the people Reynolds had harmed were finally acknowledged. The story had sparked a movement. And while no single action could erase the past, it proved one thing. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface.